This week, we talk about value and values when we do our investing. So, what is the interplay between what something is worth, its value, and what it is you hope to accomplish in your society? What are your values and how do they work together? Stick around. This is Make Better Wealth Decisions, a podcast about financial blind spots, decision making, and how the reality of higher rates, global tensions, and tariff instability impact your investments. I'm your host, John DeGuy, a portfolio manager with Design Securities in Toronto. This week, we're speaking with Tim Nash. He is the founder of Good Investing, and he has helped thousands of Canadians align their investment portfolio with their values. As an expert on socially responsible investing, sustainability, and impact investing, he is regularly featured in publications such as CBC, BNN Bloomberg, and the Globe and Mail. Tim is a host of the Responsible Investing for Sustainable Economy podcast with the Toronto Star as well. He does lots of stuff. Tim, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, John.
I wanted to begin by welcoming you back because I've only had about 4 or 5 guests that have been on the show more than once. And you're one of the people who gets to come back again because you're that, but also because what you have to say is that important. And I'd like to know if we could begin by maybe doing a quick primer of picking up where we left off last time, just by having you explain the difference between ESG investing, the idea of doing less harm, and impact investing and looking for ways to do more good.
Yeah, totally. Thank you so much for having me on, John. And really, like the quickest way I can describe it is to help people understand the headline, the sort of banner terms that we use. It used to be ethical investing, then it became socially responsible investing, SRI for a little bit. I call it sustainable investing as that big header term for having some kind of ethical lens on our investment portfolio. And then under that sort of broad banner, we have two different approaches: doing less evil versus doing more good. And these are very different. The doing less evil stuff is really about earning market rates of return. So the same returns that you would otherwise, but doing it in a way that's more aligned with our values. So this is where we can talk about ESG, environmental social governance, which is adding that data lens, the sort of sustainability data to our decision making. Often that's more of a tilt where we tilt toward companies with a better ESG score. There's also the strategy of divestment, saying, no, I don't want to own one penny of whatever is ethically abhorrent to you. And everyone has a different idea of what that might be. But divestment is saying not one penny. And then there's actually the opposite approach, which is stewardship, which is saying I want to own shares in a company deliberately so that I can use my voice as a shareholder to be able to push that company in the right direction, whatever you think that might be. So those are all doing less evil approaches that are really designed to earn market rates of return in a way that are aligned with your values. The other side of the equation is the doing more good stuff. And this is where we can talk about thematic investing. So these are investing in green themes like renewable energy or clean tech or electric cars, or they're even funds aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals as the broadest kind of impact investment theme. Those are still public market securities. Those are still stocks and bonds. But where we really are going out of our way, those aren't as diversified. They're not going to earn market rates of return. Some years, green energy might do better. Some years, it might be lower. That we're really looking at a wider range of potential returns there. And then the last approach that I absolutely love is impact investing. This is where we are sacrificing financial returns, where we're deciding to take a lower return or maybe take more risk, but to invest in things like nonprofits or co-ops. Angel investing, I think, often falls under this, where people know they're taking a bigger risk by investing in a startup than they should otherwise. But these are all impact investing is really first and foremost about having that positive impact. And then, hey, let's earn a financial return while we're having that positive impact. So those are all like different approaches. That's how I view the industry. And that what I do is help people build diversified portfolios that are a nice, healthy mix of doing less evil and doing more good.
So let's talk for a moment about aligning with values. It's something that you've mentioned a few times, and I've got a different little swerve that I'm going to take this conversation in a few minutes with regard to values. But right now, just for the sake of actually, again, having a framework in place, what would you say constitutes investing in a way that aligns with your values? What does that mean in very broad brushstrokes?
Yeah, everyone has different values, John. So it's going to look different for everyone. So I'm comfortable to speak about me personally, but to me, this means I do use divestment quite a bit. I won't invest in things like weapons manufacturers, in for profit prisons. I won't invest in fossil fuel companies, oil and gas, and pipelines. And not all my clients decide to go that far, but for me, I don't want one penny invested in those sectors. I'll be real that I also don't love investing in the big Canadian banks, in part due to them being large financiers of fossil fuels globally, but also because I know too much about the mutual fund industry and all the fees, and it's just something I've railed against so much that I don't want to be a part of that. Everyone's going to be different. They're going to have different sort of lines in the sand when it comes to those hard values. And then from there, it's really about understanding that the marketplace, it does operate on the same principles of the invisible hand of the market. I think a lot of people right now are changing their consumption habits with the whole buy Canadian, elbows up. We're really understanding that, hey, Tim Hortons isn't a Canadian brand anymore. It's not a Canadian company. A lot of people are surprised by that. So we're learning a lot about our consumption focus. And that to me, it's bringing that same approach to our investments. So understanding what are our values, what is important to us, what companies are deal breakers, like we don't want to, and then how can we leverage our investment dollars to be able to push the whole economy in a direction that does align with our worldview.
Okay, so that's a lovely jumping off point because the real reason I wanted to speak to you this week is because, like me, you're a keen follower of Canadian politics, which is one of the things I love about you. And we have a new prime minister designate, a guy by the name of Mark Carney. And I wanted to tie Carney's recent ascension to the prime minister's chair to what you've been saying. Now, I just finished reading his book, and I'm going to hold it up here so people can see this, and I'll hold it back so people can see. There it is. It's called Values. It's funny how we're talking about values right now. And it's interesting because Carney makes the case values come in two different shapes and sizes. There's value, which is without the S, the value that we get in traditional objective financial terms, but that needs to be dovetailed with values, what it is that society appreciates and deems to be important. He sees the objective use of value and the subjective imposition of or incorporation of values as being supportive and needing to be taken into account when we make our decisions, both economic and political. And increasingly, I'm finding everyone is starting to realize that in 2025, economic decisions are going to be impacted by politics, whether we like it or not. I guess I've got lots of people that have been on this podcast that have weighed in on the objective value. I want to talk to you today because I want to hear your perspective with regard to values. What are your thoughts about the interplay between making money and building a society?
Ooh, yeah. Oh, let's go there. I love this. So I have so much to say, John. So by all means, cut me off, redirect me. You can wind me up and just let me go if you want. But I get really excited about this. To me, here, I think the two sort of examples that I'd like to point towards is one is the failing of GDP, gross domestic product, as a measure of well-being within our
Mhm.
society. So that's number one, is just that our economy, the way we measure it right now, just doesn't hit all the marks. There are too many gaps in the methodology. And that number two is this notion of externalities, that once we acknowledge that the economic system hasn't been capturing all of these social and environmental and human sort of capital stocks and flows, that now we start to see, oh, okay, how do we fill in that gap? And how do we actually shift it from, if we know something is one of our core values, how do we ensure that our economy actually does value that in our systems? So number one is this notion of beyond GDP. This is not my idea. We've been fighting this battle for a very long time, but it's really an admission that GDP does a great job of capturing economic activity, but it does a terrible job of capturing things like inequality. It does a terrible job of capturing things like meeting fundamental human needs. So the housing crisis right now and the food inflation that we've seen, where those aren't optional expenditures. Like we need that stuff. And when those prices start to go up, it can have quite a negative impact on our society. And that really, this whole idea of building an economics of well-being, or building, sometimes we can talk about a sustainable economy. Again, pick whatever sort of headline banner you want. But really, what it comes down to is that, yes, measuring economic prosperity
Mhm.
and growth of wealth and productivity and economic activity are all wonderful things, but also measuring our natural capital, which is going to be nature, whether it's the health of our forests, our ecosystems, the amount of soil that we have in farmers' fields, the state of our atmosphere. These are all things that our economy really depends on nature in so many ways. And then obviously the labor pool, that understanding that, that it really is people that run the economy, and that by making investments in productivity and in education and in health and well-being, what we're doing is actually creating a more productive workforce that is able to achieve so much more sheer economic output, but in a way that leaves people better off. Really, the model that I use is like concentric circles. I think the biggest circle is very much the Earth's ecosystem, that really is, that's nature. From there, as part of that, we've got our social systems and all of our social constructs. And then as part of our society, we have our economy, right? And that really understanding that the economy depends on people, the economy depends on nature, and that unfortunately we've been growing that economic circle in the center, but while we've been shrinking our social systems and our natural systems, and that can't continue forever. It's this
Limits to
notion
growth,
that
as they say. Yeah.
limits to growth, and that the only to believe that infinite growth is possible on a finite planet, you've either got to be a madman or an economist. But that is our fundamental assumption of our system right now,
Yeah.
is that the economy can grow infinitely without regard to our finite resources, and frankly, our very fractured, or right now brittle, social system. That there is a
Right.
lot of division in the world, and we can talk about political divides, we
Right.
can talk about economic divides, but the cracks are starting to show in our social system as well.
Okay, so let's go there. So again, I want people to see here that the subtitle of Carney's book is called Building a Better World for All. And although Carney has really an excellent resume with regard to his credentials as a finance guy, he also makes a strong case for the things that you talk about: inclusivity, fairness, especially intergenerational fairness and the like. And he discusses, again, the idea of the interplay between value, money, and values, which is where we want to be as a society. And I think he might be the guy who is, let's say, at the right place at the right time for Canada in 2025, because in the book, he spends many chapters talking about what he went through, the decisions that were made, working with other international leaders, both political leaders, central bankers, and what have you, during the global financial crisis of '07 to '09 and the COVID crisis of 2020, 2021. And it's my considered opinion that the Trump tariff crisis will be the third major global economic crisis of our generation. And here's a guy who fortuitously shows up right at the right time, having already marshaled both the Canadian economy and the UK economy. That's not even talking about his role in Brexit, which was also very significant, and having done a good job of getting people through these challenges. And it's my view that the Trump tariffs pose a different kind of existential threat, maybe more to the country rather than to the threat that COVID posed to the health of the planet and that the global financial crisis posed to the financial stability of the planet. But I think there are major crises, and wondering what your thoughts are on all that in terms of where we've been in the past 20 years and what that, or maybe even 15 years, and what that might portend for the next little while.
Yeah, and maybe it's helpful for listeners to know that I'm 42, that I studied sort of economics philosophy in my undergrad and then did my master's in Sweden in sustainable finance and graduated straight into the 2008 crash.
Right.
So I was right. I was of that generation that got screwed over there. My first steps into the workforce were not to be. Sustainability very much got thrown on the back burner back then. And the whole banking sector, the whole investment sector really froze up for quite a while. So there were no jobs available. And that kind of triggered my entrepreneurial journey. Really, I'm someone that has lived essentially my entire career in either the depths of a crisis or the shadows of a crisis. And whereas these crises were often spaced a little further apart, that we could talk about them individually, now a lot of the language I hear about is the multi crisis, that we're dealing
Like
with an
crisis.
affordability crisis, the poly crisis, multi solutions. This is it, that it really is this notion of housing, food, homelessness,
Debt
climate,
levels.
and that debt levels absolutely, that, really we're just stumbling from crisis to crisis right now. And that it really is unfortunate because part of the problem, I used to think when it came to climate change, that things would just have to get bad enough, that there would be a big enough storm that people realized, oh, geez, okay, this is something, we got to do something about this. We might want to take this seriously. And storm after storm after storm, it just wasn't happening. And really, I do worry that potentially the biggest part of our crisis right now is our response, that there's almost seems to be this descent into sort of populism or fascism, or we can decide how far we think this thing's going to go, but that our response to this poly crisis is not, so far, has not been very good. Now, Mark Carney offers, I think, a very different approach because he actually understands these crises, I think, a lot better than most people do. And especially with the intersectionality of the economy being linked to all of these different crises, that if there is someone that can help us navigate, I know he's certainly got the academic credentials, John, no question. I was worried a little bit about him being the right messenger, but now in the age of Trump, my goodness, doesn't it feel good to potentially have an adult at the table
Yeah.
who can understand these things and bring a very rational perspective to what seems to be a very emotional decision making south of the border. I think time will tell on whether he is the right guy or not, but I think certainly Canadians, judging by the polls, are as I think as excited as I am about having someone with his economic credentials, but who also gets it from a sustainability perspective.
So it's interesting because I heard you say that he would be the adult in the room, which is a really obvious counterpoint to the person who's running the show south of the border. But also, the observation that I have is that this is a man who is a real technocrat. And I don't know that there has been a technocratic prime minister in Canada, perhaps since Mike Pearson, and maybe even going as far back as William Lyon Mackenzie King. But most of our politicians in Canada have been more or less either career politicians or people who came into politics without having had as an extensive a career as, for instance, as Carney has had, in terms of having been on the global stage for 20 years, making these decisions and being on the A team that's actually fighting in the crisis, along with all the other world leaders. Even though he hasn't been elected, he's been elected Prime Minister of Canada because the party in power has chosen him to be that. He hasn't faced the general public yet. But it's interesting that we actually have a person who has ironically has never held elected office prior to this past week, and yet has probably more experience in making at least small p political decisions, decisions that have political and economic overtones, where he's rubbing shoulders with central bankers and heads of government and what have you, and making those decisions and being a determinant with regard to what will and will not come of it. Now, I'm going to ask you about something that I don't know that we've ever discussed this before, and I'm not familiar. I don't know if you're familiar with the phrase. Have you ever heard the phrase a Minsky moment? Have you ever heard that phrase?
That rings a bell. That rings a bell.
Okay. So there's this guy by the name of Hyman Minsky who says that Minsky moment is the onset of a major market collapse, which is brought on by speculative activity that defines an unsustainable bullish period. Now,
Sure.
as you will know, I've written a book called Bullshift, and
Yes.
one of the things I talk about in Bullshift is that people are prone to optimism bias, and they don't really think about the risks they may be taking, and they don't necessarily have the psychological constitution to get through the tough times when the tough times appear. So that's what a Minsky moment is, and a Minsky moment is when the house of cards starts to collapse because I don't think Hyman Minsky said it quite in these words, but it's words that I heard you say that I think are apt. And that is that in a polycrisis, everything starts to cascade downward at the same time, and then everything collapses because you can't keep all the balls in the air. How close do you think we are to a Minsky moment in March of 2025?
Cool. Oof. I don't have a crystal ball nor a time machine. And so here's what I'll say is that had you asked me 15 years ago, so back in 2009, about how long would it take for us to actually understand the sort of the climate crisis and to take real action on it. On the political side, I would have thought we would have been way further along than we are now.
Yeah,
But I
me
gotta
too.
say, on the industrial side, and like the amount, like the cost decreases of renewable energy and batteries and the uptake of electric vehicles in the world right now, and the size and scale of the green economy right now, I wouldn't have guessed that it would have been this big. So I just think that when it comes to complex systems, there is no binary answer here, John. There isn't in terms of a yes or a no. I think that every sector is going to react differently. I think that geographic diversification, like this is why, from an investment standpoint, I'm all about diversification, right? That's an absolute core value is to be as diversified as possible given your ethical constraints. And never has that been truer because, how much of this is going to be region specific, sector specific, industry specific. It's going to be really, really hard to predict that if there is a crash, if we are in a Minsky moment, let alone where it's gonna happen. And the other thing I'll say is, but just the line that's coming to me right now is when I don't know if this was one of the sort of Hollywood things from, I believe it was A Big Short, but this notion that the market can stay irrational longer than I can stay solvent,
That
right?
came from way before The Big Short. That's a line that's been used
Okay,
for a few decades. It may have even been Keynes. It may have even been John Maynard Keynes who said that. So it goes back, I think, to the 1930s.
there you go. So the echoes, it's been echoing in my head even longer. And that, but really, it's this notion of trying to predict when it happens, I think is a bit of a fool's game. So to me, it's just understanding that the state of the economy, in my view, the current economy that we've got is unsustainable. Whether it's going to take 6 months or 6 years or 6 decades for that to fully materialize, I don't know. And I would say that I think in my youth, I would have said it was going to happen faster. I think that now I've learned, I don't know if it's like patience or if I've just learned that the strength of status quo bias, that we're just so slow to actually shift things and to actually want to get it to change. I will say that it does feel that we are in a little bit of a moment right now. I think of the sort of caterpillar turning into a butterfly, where there's a moment where it all just turns to goo. And my goodness, south of the border, it feels like that right now. And to me, it's just scary about what does emerge from that, that we just don't know. We just don't know. But I'm not of the view that a collapse is imminent at all. I'm not. I am of the view that capitalism is the best system that we've come up with so far. But my view is that we need some big changes to capitalism in order to make sure that it does work for the vast majority of people, because it's not right now, and to make sure that it does work for the planet, because it doesn't right now. And I think that it's about understanding that the sooner we get our act together and actually start working on these solutions, the easier that transition is. Whereas the more we kick the can down the road, and whether it's debt or whether it's affordable housing or whether it's climate change, the worse the problem is going to get.
Okay, good. I think that's a good way of summarizing that. And I think I agree with you on most things. I will also say I neither do I have a crystal ball that functions or a time machine. I don't know either. My sense is that we're actually closer than your sense. I don't
Yeah.
know when, but I'm fairly confident that we are heading toward this and it will be quite a challenge for a lot of us. And one of the reasons I wrote Bullshift is because when it happens, however it happens, people will say, "Oh, why did no one tell me?" And it's sort of like I feel like I people have been grabbing me by the lapels for 25 years saying the climate situation is a real challenge. We have to do something. And it's one of the things that Carney refers to as the tragedy of the horizon. Like it's always so far away. that people think they can put it off. But in fact, if we would have been doing more with regard to helping the economy and it'd be more sustainable when Al Gore was talking about it a generation ago, it would have cost a heck of a lot less than it's going to cost now. All right, let's see if we can wrap this up. Tim, the way I like to conclude my podcast is always to ask people what they would say, what advice they would give to people to help them make better wealth decisions. So, what advice would you give people?
So to me, it's that really boring works. That
Okay.
my advice to people is really to optimize for simplicity as much as possible. And I think it's so important to have confidence and trust in your investment approach, whatever it is. And that to me, the element, what I add to that with my view is understanding that when you do ethically believe in the companies that you're invested in, it makes it so much easier to stick to that plan during these more tumultuous times. I'm getting a lot of questions from some folks who want to completely divest from the US. They're really taking this Canadian pride thing seriously. And to me, it's like, no, 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 like diversification is still a core value. But let's look at the companies inside your US equity portfolio and make sure that those do align with your values. Because even if you don't agree with the direction of the administration and where things are going, it's not going to be everyone. Like, let's remind ourselves that there are a lot of good people living south of the border, a lot of really good people, a lot of really good companies. We're not going to don't let's try to avoid painting with broad brushstrokes, but let's also err on the side of simplicity and as much as possible in uncertain times. Really, for me, John, it's if it collapses, like if it's the big one, I don't think it really matters where your money's invested. So to me, it's
And
more
on that
about yeah,
note, Tim, I want to thank you for your time today because I think your insights are invaluable and you're relatively rare. I don't think I have to tell you that within the Canadian financial services industry. Most people talk about value, the simple objective dollars and cents. Relatively few people in the industry are a mensch like you who actually incorporate values and thinking about what it is we want to accomplish. Your perspective is always refreshing, and I want to thank you for your time today.
it's always a pleasure, John.
This podcast is not to be construed as offering specific investment advice. Please consult a qualified advisor before acting. My books, Stand Up to the Financial Services Industry and Bullshift, are available online. If you'd like to meet to discuss how the topics in this podcast affect you directly, please visit my website.